I have with me Mary Price. She is a general counsel for the nonprofit Families Against Mandatory Minimums. And what they want is what they call compassionate release for sick and elderly prisoners. Mary, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me on, Reverend Peterson.
I appreciate it. You can call me Jesse.
All right, Jesse.
So, Mary, explain, what do you mean by mandatory minimum for inmates?
Oh, that's a great question. The federal government and some of the states, a number of the states, of course, provide for incarceration for people who have offended our laws. But a number of them add what are called mandatory minimum terms. And that means that the judge has to impose a minimum term if a certain crime is committed. A classic example is the mandatory minimum for certain drug offenses, which are set at 5 or 10 or 20 years, depending on the quantity of drugs that the person is associated with. So what this means is that state legislators or Congress judge the individual, determine what punishment they should have, and take that job away from the judges, who we think ought to have the discretion to look not only at the crime that the individual committed, but the entire person, the circumstances that led to it, and the circumstances that led to their own offense.
And when you say the circumstances that led to committing a crime, give me an example of what you mean by that.
That's a good question. So, for example, these mandatory minimums are set by way of drug quantity. And so you may have a kingpin, somebody who runs the operation, who has a large quantity of drugs and deserves a significant punishment. But the courier or the underling who works for that individual may also be associated for reasons of sentencing with that very same quantity of drugs, and they're subject to the very same sentence. But you and I can see that they're very different, at least on those facts. They're very different individuals.
What's that noise? Hold on, Mary. Oh, okay. Go ahead, Mary. The noise stopped. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it might be a siren outside. I'm downtown.
I thought it was, yeah.
Yeah, okay. They're not coming for me yet.
Thank God.
Oh, truly. Anyway, so those two individuals were very different, but in the eyes of mandatory minimums, they are treated exactly the same, and we call that unwarranted uniformity.
Why should we have that type of sympathy for criminals? Because if they're not punished to the fullest of the law, if they're not punished to the fullest of the law, then they will get out and they will commit the crime again, and it would be even worse than the first time around, because most people who commit crimes are not self-corrected. They don't have a sense of self-control.
Right. I understand the question. I think that there's a couple things I want to say about it. Number one, we're not against punishment. What we wanted to work for and to ensure is that the punishment fits the crime and fits the individual. So what we want to do is to give judges the discretion to determine what's the appropriate offense, or punishment rather, for the offense, and then to impose that.
Oppose it? Did you say? Oh, impose it. Oh, okay.
Yeah, impose. Sorry, okay. I'm sorry. I'll get a little closer.
No problem. Go ahead.
Yes, impose that sentence rather than have their hands tied, because occasionally there might be a circumstance that will make the judge, and often this happens, make the judge say, well, now, wait a minute, this person is not as culpable, and I wish I could give them a shorter sentence. That's one thing. And then the other thing is that we know that the length of incarceration doesn't necessarily change anything about drug use, drug overdose death, or drug dealing. The Pew Center on the States did a big report looking at data from a number of different agencies at a number of different state levels, and that's what they found. So I think we've got to kind of unlink this business of sentence length and public safety and take a much more nuanced look at it.
But if you have noticed over the last 8 to 9 years, or maybe even longer, most judges can't be trusted anymore. They're very liberal. They are not good people. And if we trust the judge to make a decision, most of the time they're going to go with the criminals and not consider the safety of the communities or the good folks who are not committing the crime. So we can't give the judge, or should not give the judge, that type of authority.
Well, I'm not sure you and I will agree on what most judges are like, but I do think that we give the judges a job to be judges. It's a branch of government. It's an independent branch, and it ought to be able to do the job that we gave that branch of government in the Constitution to do its job. We may not agree with it, but that's what appeals courts are for.
A good example of that is President Trump was wanting to put a hold on countries where radical Islamic Muslims were coming from for about 6 months or so. And there was a judge more than once who prevented that from happening. And we all know that judge should not even be a judge. But because he is a judge, he's a liberal, and he did it, or she, I forgot if a man or woman, but they did it based on how they feel and not what's best for the country or following the law.
Well, I haven't read their opinion, so I don't know what motivated them. But generally, when judges make decisions like that, they have to explain why they're following precedent and the law, why they're abiding by the Constitution and the laws that govern the particular circumstance. So I can't give you an opinion. I'd have to read what those judges decided. And I expect that the Trump administration is going to appeal those decisions if they haven't already. Right. So we'll see those go up.
You mentioned the kingpin. If the people didn't purchase drugs from the kingpin or pins, the kingpin will have no power, no authority at all. Is that true?
I imagine, yeah.
And so,
their job is to provide drugs. They see their job as, that's not their job. Their crime is to provide drugs.
Right. Yes. But if the folks were not buying the drugs, then the kingpin couldn't sell the drugs.
That's right. You know what? I wanted to say something else about that link. The other thing that we've been learning about, states around the country have been reducing their reliance on incarceration. And I think that the federal system is looking at that very closely. But we know that more than 30 states around the country have both reduced their reliance on incarceration and have seen their crime rates fall. So, you and I were talking earlier, you talked earlier about needing to lock people up because we need to keep our communities safe. But at least as to the sentence length, it looks like we can be a little bit more nuanced in terms of the sentences that we provide, because it isn't the length of time. Other very smart people have said that it's the certainty and the swiftness of punishment rather than the length of punishment that deters individuals from criminal conduct.
I agree that swift punishment is right and proper, but we can't trust these judges. They're no good. Not all of them, but most. I want just recently I saw a report where a judge forced the U.S. to accept DACA application. This is for the illegals who are here. And I saw this, I believe, in the New York Times. And see, that type of judge cannot be trusted. But if we leave a decision up to judges like that, they're going to put Americans at risk for their own personal gain. Would you agree?
No, I wouldn't. But what I would say is that the interesting thing about law is that it's a process of interpretation and precedent. And there can be people on both sides of a legal issue who feel very, very strongly that their position is correct. But at the end of the day, they have to base it. They have to put the building blocks together of the correct opinion based not on their personal opinions, but on law. And that's how those are judged. But I hope we could take just a minute before you and I have to stop talking, because I know you have other important guests, to talk about compassionate release. Do you have a minute for that?
Yes, go ahead, yes.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've been working on and that we've been working on here at FAM is to try and promote the concept and to strengthen the concept that certain prisoners who are, for example, terminally ill or debilitated because of a condition, illness or a condition, who no longer pose a threat to public safety, who may be costing the states and the federal government a great deal of money to go home or to leave the prison at least to serve out their last hours and days in a hospice in order to, in a process called compassionate release. And as it turns out, nearly every state in the country, as well as the federal government, have a compassionate release program, but it doesn't get used very much.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm.
What is your website for the folks that they can check out what you guys are doing?
Oh, splendid. It's www.famm.org.
www.famm.org. Families Against Mandatory Minimum. Mary, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Jesse, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
All right. Bye.
All right now. I want the strength of America back. I don't want all this false compassion and letting the prisoners out because they're ill. They need to think about that before they commit the crime. And when you see these people being punished, you're less likely to commit the crimes. If you know you're going to die in jail, believe me, you'll think about it twice. I need you all to subscribe, support us on Patreon, like us on Facebook, and follow me on Twitter.
Got it.